At the edge of the valley, where pine trees thickened and the wind moved unhindered for miles, the cabin sat half finished and already the subject of local gossip. People passing by slowed their horses or trucks just enough to stare. Some laughed out loud. Others muttered comments meant to sound like advice but landed closer to ridicule. The man working there heard it all, even when no one said a word. He could feel it in the way conversations stopped when he approached, in the sideways glances exchanged whenever his project came up. Building a cabin was nothing new in that region. Everyone built cabins. But building a second wall around one, that was something else entirely. He wasn't a loud man, and he didn't argue with anyone who questioned him. He simply kept working. Each morning, before the frost fully lifted from the ground, he hauled timber into place and measured the spacing with almost obsessive care. The inner cabin was already complete, solid, tight, and no different from any other small structure nearby. By most standards, he could have moved in right then and been fine. Winter was coming, yes, but plenty of people survived winters in cabins just like that one. That was exactly why the neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. Why fix what wasn't broken? Why waste time, wood, and energy on something nobody else needed? The jokes came easily. Someone said he was building a cabin for his cabin. Another claimed he must be planning to rent the space between the walls to squirrels. A few older men shook their heads and spoke with the confidence of experience, saying cold always finds a way in, no matter how clever you think you are. They had lived there their whole lives, and winter had taught them one unchanging lesson: you fight the cold with fire, not fancy ideas. If you were cold, you burned more wood. If you ran out of wood, you froze. Simple. But the man didn't see winter as an enemy to fight head-on. He saw it as a force to be understood. Years earlier, long before he ever owned land, he had read about old structures that stayed warm without massive fires. Stone buildings buried partially in earth. Farmhouses with double layers and dead air spaces. Techniques passed down quietly, often forgotten because they weren't fast or flashy. He had paid attention to those details when others skimmed past them. And now, with a small piece of land and limited resources, he believed those forgotten ideas mattered more than ever. Money was tight. That fact alone made the laughter sting more than he let on. Timber wasn't cheap, and every board he used for the second wall was a board he couldn't use somewhere else. The neighbors assumed that meant he was careless or foolish. They didn't know he counted every nail, reused offcuts, and chose slower progress over shortcuts that might fail in January. What they saw as waste, he saw as insurance. Firewood took time to cut, split, and stack. He knew winters where snow piled so high it made hauling wood a daily battle. If a second wall could reduce how much he needed to burn, then it wasn't waste, it was survival. As days passed, the second wall began to take shape, standing a short distance away from the first. The gap between them looked awkward, almost wrong, like a mistake left unfinished. That gap became the main source of mockery. People asked why he didn't just fill it with insulation or solid wood. He never answered directly. He just kept the spacing consistent, sealing joints carefully, ensuring there were no gaps where wind could roar straight through. To an untrained eye, it looked like extra work with no payoff. To him, that space was the entire point. Even friends questioned him, and that hurt more than the laughter. A man he'd known for years stopped by one evening and leaned against a post, watching quietly for a long time. Finally, he said he admired the effort but worried it would all be for nothing. Winter didn't care about theories, he said. Winter tested what was real. The man building the cabin nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. He knew the risk. If the idea failed, he would be colder than everyone else, poorer in wood, and remembered as the fool who tried to outthink the weather. At night, alone inside the inner cabin, he sometimes questioned himself. The silence made doubts louder. He imagined January winds howling through unseen cracks, imagined the second wall doing nothing at all. He thought about the laughter continuing, louder and more justified. But then he remembered the reason he started. He didn't want to spend every waking winter hour feeding a fire. He didn't want to wake up to frozen water buckets or go to sleep in his coat. He wanted steadiness, predictability, a cabin that worked with the cold instead of constantly reacting to it. The rhythm of work became his answer to doubt. Measure, cut, lift, secure, repeat. The second wall rose inch by inch, indifferent to opinion. Neighbors came and went, their comments changing little, but something subtle shifted. The laughter became less frequent, not because they believed in the idea, but because his persistence made it harder to dismiss him as simply lazy or confused. Whatever else he was committed. And commitment, even when misplaced, earns a certain quiet respect. By late autumn, the outer wall stood complete. Snow threatened in the distance, and most people were already focused inward, sealing their own cabins and stacking final cords of firewood. The man stood back one evening and looked at his work. From a distance, the cabin looked thicker, heavier, almost fortified. It didn't look efficient or elegant. It looked stubborn. And in a place where winter punished hesitation, stubbornness was sometimes the most valuable trait of all. No one applauded when he finished. There was no moment of validation. The neighbors simply went back to their lives, convinced that winter would soon teach him a harsh lesson. He went inside, closed the door, and lit a small fire, not to prove anything, but to wait. The cold would come. It always did, and when it arrived, it would settle the argument in a way no words ever could. What most people failed to notice was that the second wall was never meant to be impressive. It wasn't designed to look strong or heavy or modern. In fact, from the outside, it appeared almost unfinished, as if something essential had been forgotten. That illusion was part of the reason the idea confused so many people. They expected insulation to look like effort, thick materials, packed fibers, something you could point to and say, "That's what's keeping the cold out." What he was building worked in a quieter way, one that didn't announce itself unless you understood what you were looking at. The space between the two walls was the heart of the design. He measured it carefully, not too wide, not too narrow. Too small, and it would conduct cold too easily. Too large, and air would begin to circulate, carrying heat away instead of holding it. This wasn't guesswork. He had spent nights reading old building notes, studying how temperature moved through materials, learning how still air behaved when trapped and undisturbed. Air, when held still, was one of the best insulators available. People forgot that because air was invisible and free things were rarely respected. He didn't fill the gap with straw, sawdust, or modern insulation. He left it mostly empty on purpose. The goal was not to block heat with mass, but to slow its escape. Heat moved from warm to cold, always searching for balance. The second wall forced that process to take longer. Instead of warmth passing directly through a single barrier into the freezing air outside, it had to cross the inner wall, enter the trapped air space, lose energy slowly, then pass through the outer wall. By the time it reached the outside, much of its strength was already gone. Wind was another enemy he planned for. In winter, wind didn't just bring cold, it stole heat. A single wall, no matter how solid, still felt the pressure of moving air. Tiny cracks became channels. Cold air pushed in, warm air was pulled out. The outer wall acted as a shield, taking the punishment of wind so the inner cabin didn't have to. Even when gusts slammed against the structure, the inner walls remained calm, protected by that buffer zone of trapped air. The difference between standing in the wind and standing behind a barrier was enormous, and he was giving his cabin that barrier on all sides. Moisture mattered too, though few people talked about it. Damp cold was worse than dry cold, and condensation inside walls could rob heat and rot wood over time. The second wall allowed moisture to dissipate gradually instead of building up inside the living space. He left small, carefully placed vents where needed. Not enough to create drafts, but enough to prevent trapped humidity from turning into frost. This balance was delicate, and he adjusted it as he worked, responding to the environment rather than following a rigid plan. Every decision came back to simplicity. He didn't trust complicated systems because they failed when you needed them most. No moving parts. No reliance on fuel or power, just structure and physics doing what they had always done. Long before modern insulation and heating systems existed, people survived winters just as harsh by using ideas like this. Somewhere along the way, those ideas were replaced by convenience. Burn more fuel, add more heat, solve every problem by pushing harder instead of thinking differently. The neighbors saw the second wall and assumed it was about thickness. They were wrong. It was about separation, about breaking the direct path between warmth and cold. A single thick wall still allowed heat to travel straight through. Two walls with space between them forced heat to take a longer, slower journey. That delay was everything. It meant the fire didn't have to work as hard. It meant the cabin temperature didn't swing wildly when the fire died down at night. It meant mornings would be bearable instead of brutal. He tested ideas as he went. On colder evenings, he stood with his hand against the inner wall and compared it to other cabins he'd visited. The difference was subtle at first but unmistakable. The wall didn't feel as cold. Not neutral, just less biting. That told him the heat wasn't rushing out as fast. He made small adjustments, sealing one joint, widening another gap by a fraction of an inch. This wasn't guesswork or blind faith. It was observation and response, the way people once learned before manuals and experts replaced experience. The outer wall didn't need to be as perfect as the inner one. That was another advantage. It existed to block wind, snow, and sudden temperature shifts, not to create comfort directly. If the outer wall got cold, it didn't matter. If snow piled against it, even better. It added another insulating layer. While others fought snow away from their cabins, he let it settle naturally, knowing it helped more than it hurt. The idea felt backward to most people, but nature often worked that way. What he was really building was stability. Single-wall cabins depended entirely on constant heat input. Miss a night of feeding the fire, and the temperature dropped fast. Pipes froze, fingers numbed. With the second wall, temperature changes slowed. Even when the fire burned low, the cabin held on to its warmth longer. That kind of thermal inertia changed everything. It turned winter from a constant emergency into a manageable season. The brilliance of the design lay in how unremarkable it seemed. No smoke, no noise, no visible proof of success, just quiet resistance to the cold. The neighbors couldn't see that while the sun went down and temperatures plunged, the heat inside his cabin lingered. They wouldn't see it until winter arrived in full force, and comparisons became unavoidable. He knew explaining it wouldn't help. Most people didn't change their minds because of explanations. They changed when reality contradicted their assumptions. So he let the wall speak for itself. He finished the last seals, stepped back, and trusted the physics he had built into the structure. The second wall wasn't a gamble to him. It was a conversation with winter, one he felt confident he had finally learned how to speak. The first real storm arrived without ceremony, slipping into the valley overnight and announcing itself only by the silence it left behind. By morning the world was white and still, the kind of cold that felt heavy rather than sharp. Smoke rose early from most chimneys as people rushed to stoke their fires higher than usual. Inside those cabins, the air already felt brittle, the kind that dried throats and stiffened fingers even before the sun fully rose. Winter had officially taken hold, and everyone braced for the long fight they knew so well. Inside his cabin, the man woke slowly, almost confused by the quiet warmth that greeted him. The fire from the night before had burned down to embers, yet the air wasn't biting. He sat up, waiting for the familiar shock of cold on his skin, but it didn't come. The temperature had dropped outside, dramatically so, but inside the cabin the change felt muted, delayed. He pulled on his boots and stepped across the floor, noticing that even the boards beneath his feet didn't sting the way they usually did on winter mornings. He added a small log to the fire, more out of habit than necessity, and watched the flames catch easily. Usually, on mornings like this, a fire struggled at first, fighting cold air and cold walls that sucked the heat away as fast as it appeared. This time was different. The fire seemed eager, as if the cabin itself was helping rather than resisting. Heat spread evenly instead of vanishing upward and outward. He felt it settle around him instead of racing for the ceiling. Outside, neighbors were already moving, bundled tight, breath visible in thick clouds. The storm had hit them hard. Doors opened and closed quickly as people rushed to check animals, clear paths, and haul extra wood inside. Conversations were short, voices sharp with cold. A few people glanced toward his cabin as they passed, noting the lack of frantic activity. There was smoke from his chimney, yes, but not the roaring plume they expected on a morning like this. It didn't register fully yet, just a small detail filed away unconsciously. As days passed, the cold deepened. The initial storm was followed by another, and then another, each one pressing temperatures lower. Nights became long and unforgiving. In most cabins, fires burned constantly, sometimes too hot, sometimes too low, rarely just right. People woke several times a night to feed the flames, knowing that letting the fire die, even briefly, could mean frozen water or cracked walls by morning. Sleep came in fragments, shaped around the needs of the stove. In his cabin, nights were quieter. He still fed the fire, but not obsessively. When it burned down, the temperature dipped slowly instead of plunging, He noticed it first in small ways. The way his breath didn't fog immediately when he woke. The way the walls no longer felt like blocks of ice radiating cold inward. Even the sound of the cabin was different. Wood contracts sharply in extreme cold, popping and creaking as temperatures drop. Those sounds were softer now, less urgent, as if the structure wasn't being shocked by sudden changes. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by under the pretense of borrowing a tool. The man invited him inside without comment. The door closed, and the visitor paused, not saying anything at first. His eyes moved around the room, taking in the fire, the walls, the stillness. It wasn't hot inside, not uncomfortably so, but it was unmistakably warm. Warm in a steady way that didn't rely on standing close to the stove. The neighbor rubbed his hands together out of habit, then slowly stopped, realizing he didn't need to. "You running that stove all day?" he finally asked. The man shook his head. "Couple times. Not much." The neighbor grunted, unconvinced but unsettled. He stayed only a few minutes longer, making polite conversation before leaving. Outside, the cold hit him hard again, almost offensively. He turned once more to look at the cabin, as if expecting to see something different now that he knew what was inside. Word spread quietly. No one announced it, but people noticed. They noticed that he carried in less firewood, that his chimney smoked less, that he wasn't constantly chopping, hauling, or rushing. On the coldest mornings, when the thermometer dropped to numbers that made people curse out loud, his cabin didn't look any different from the day before. Snow piled up against the outer wall, and he didn't rush to clear it away, while others shoveled frantically to keep snow from touching their cabins. He let it stay. Understanding it added another layer of insulation. The true test came during a week, long cold snap when temperatures refused to rise at all. Even midday offered no relief. In most cabins, the cold crept in regardless of effort. Walls radiated chill, and the air near the floor stayed icy no matter how hard the fire burned. People layered clothes indoors and still complained. Some ran through their wood piles faster than expected, anxiety growing with each passing day. Inside his cabin, a thermometer mounted near the door quietly recorded the difference. Compared to cabins nearby, his stayed consistently warmer, sometimes by a little, sometimes by a lot. On the worst days, the difference reached a shocking margin: 21 degrees. It wasn't something he announced or bragged about. It was simply a number he noted, written in the margin of a small notebook where he tracked temperatures and fire usage. To him, it confirmed what he already felt in his bones. The second wall was doing exactly what it was meant to do. Eventually, curiosity overcame pride. Another neighbor stopped by, then another. Some came with excuses, others with no excuse at all. Each time the reaction was the same. A pause just inside the door, a quiet glance around, a subtle shift in posture as their bodies registered warmth they hadn't expected. No one laughed anymore. Jokes were replaced with questions, careful at first, then more direct. How wide was the gap? Did he insulate it? Did snow cause problems? He answered simply, without triumph. What changed most wasn't just the temperature, it was the mood. Winter usually brought tension, short tempers, and exhaustion. In his cabin, evenings felt calmer. He could sit and read without constantly adjusting the fire. He slept through most nights without waking to feed it. The cold was still there, just outside the walls, but it no longer dictated every decision. The cabin held its own, quietly resisting instead of constantly reacting. The laughter that once followed him through the valley was gone. In its place was something heavier and more uncomfortable for those who had mocked him evidence. Winter had arrived, and it hadn't proven him foolish. It had proven him right. And in a place where winter was the ultimate judge, that verdict carried more weight than any opinion ever could. What made the difference wasn't strength or thickness, or even craftsmanship in the way most people understood it. It was control. Control over how heat behaved once it was created. In a typical single-wall cabin, warmth was always on the run, leaking outward the moment it appeared. You could feel it near the stove, but the farther you moved away, the colder the space became. Walls acted like cold sponges, absorbing heat and passing it straight through to the outside air. No matter how hard the fire worked, it was always chasing loss. In his cabin, the second wall changed the rules of that chase. Heat no longer had a straight path to escape. The inner wall still warmed up, but instead of dumping that warmth directly into the frozen outdoors, it released it into the trapped air space. That air didn't move. It didn't swirl or draft or carry heat away. It simply sat there, quietly resisting change. Still air slowed heat transfer dramatically, and that delay was enough to tip the balance in favor of warmth. The outer wall played its role just as quietly. It took the full impact of winter, the wind that scarred heat from surfaces, the snow that piled and melted and refroze, the sudden drops in temperature that shocked unprotected structures. The inner cabin barely felt those extremes. Instead of reacting instantly to every weather shift, it experienced winter as a softened echo. Cold still arrived, but it arrived tired, diminished, having lost much of its force along the way. Wind, more than temperature alone, was often what made cabins miserable. A calm, cold night could be uncomfortable but manageable. Add wind, and that same temperature became brutal. Wind stripped heat from walls, forced cold air through microscopic gaps, and created drafts that no amount of firewood could fully overcome. The second wall broke that cycle. Wind hit the outer shell and lost momentum. By the time it reached the inner wall, it was no longer wind at all, just pressure against still air. Another overlooked factor was thermal mass and timing. In a single, wall cabin, temperature changes were sudden. When the fire burned low, the cabin cooled quickly. When the fire roared, the space overheated and then lost that excess warmth just as fast. It was a constant swing between extremes. The air gap between the walls acted like a buffer, smoothing those swings. Heat stored in the trapped air, and inner wall surfaces released slowly over time, keeping the cabin temperature more stable. Even when the fire wasn't actively burning, moisture control quietly added to the effect. In many cabins, condensation formed on cold interior walls, especially overnight. That moisture pulled heat from the air and left surfaces feeling colder than the actual temperature. Over time, it also degraded the structure itself. With the second wall, the inner walls stayed warmer, reducing condensation. The living space felt drier, more comfortable, and easier to heat. Even small improvements in dryness made a noticeable difference in perceived warmth. Snow, which most people treated as an enemy, became an ally. As it piled against the outer wall, it added yet another insulating layer. Snow trapped air within its structure, further slowing heat loss. While neighbors shoveled obsessively to keep snow away from their cabins, he allowed it to accumulate naturally, clearing only doors and paths. The cabin grew quieter as the snow thickened, sound dampened and cold held at bay. It was as if winter itself had been recruited into the design. The ceiling benefited too. Warm air naturally rose, and in most cabins, it escaped upward just as easily as it did through the walls. His roof followed the same principle as the walls, creating separation and trapping air where it mattered most. Heat gathered overhead and stayed there, instead of vanishing into the sky. The result was an even temperature throughout the space, not just near the stove but along the floor, the corners and the far walls. What surprised even him was how little effort it took once the system was in place. He didn't need to manage it constantly. There were no adjustments to make during storms, no emergency measures during cold snaps. The cabin simply behaved differently. It held warmth the way a well made thermos holds heat, not by creating more, but by refusing to let go of what it already had. Firewood usage dropped noticeably. Logs that once lasted a night now stretched into the next day. Stacks of wood shrank more slowly. The physical strain of cutting, hauling, and splitting eased, which mattered more than comfort alone. In winter, energy was currency. Every hour not spent feeding a fire was an hour saved for rest, repairs, or simply enduring the season with less exhaustion. The design didn't eliminate cold, it managed it. The temperature inside never ignored reality outside, but it didn't mirror it either. Extreme cold became a condition to accommodate, rather than a crisis to fight. The cabin's warmth felt earned and reliable, not temporary and fragile. It didn't depend on vigilance. It depended on structure. What stood out most was how ordinary it all seemed once winter settled in. There was no dramatic moment where the cabin announced its superiority. It simply worked, day after day, night after night. The fire burned lower. The air stayed warmer. The walls felt less hostile. Comfort became the default instead of a fleeting reward for constant labor. People often assumed warmth came from effort, from burning more, working harder, enduring more discomfort. His cabin proved something quieter and more unsettling. Warmth could come from restraint, from slowing things down, from placing barriers in the right places, and then letting physics do what it had always done. The second wall didn't fight winter. It delayed it, softened it, and ultimately made it manageable. That was why the cabin stayed so much warmer. Not because it created more heat, but because it stopped wasting it. By the time winter began to loosen its grip, the valley felt different. Not because the cold had been mild, it hadn't, but because people had been forced to pay attention. Long winters always taught lessons, but this one left a particularly clear impression. Cabins stood weathered and tired, woodpiles noticeably thinner than expected, and faces showed the strain of months spent fighting the cold day after day. In the middle of it all, his cabin looked almost unchanged, as if it had passed through the season with less resistance than anyone thought possible. The change in attitude was subtle at first. No one admitted they had been wrong. That kind of honesty came slowly, if at all. Instead, conversations shifted tone. The laughter that once followed mention of the second wall never returned. In its place were careful observations and casual questions, asked as though the answers were merely interesting rather than deeply unsettling. People asked how much wood he had burned, how often he fed the stove, whether the cold had ever truly settled in. He answered plainly, without exaggeration. The facts spoke loudly enough on their own. When the snow finally began to melt and paths turned to mud, neighbors started stopping by more frequently. Not to joke, not to criticize, but to look. They walked around the cabin, examining the space between the walls, tapping the outer boards, peering into corners where snow still clung stubbornly. Some tried to hide their interest behind practical talk about repairs or spring plans. Others were more direct, asking how difficult it would be to add something similar to their own cabins. He didn't claim ownership over the idea. He didn't call it innovation or genius. To him, it was simply an application of principles that had always existed. He explained that he hadn't invented anything. He had just paid attention. Attention to how heat moved, how wind behaved, how old structures survived before fuel was cheap and abundant. The idea that such solutions had been overlooked for so long made some people uncomfortable. It challenged the belief that progress always meant more technology, more consumption, more effort. A few neighbors tried to replicate the design quickly, already thinking about the next winter. Some did it well, others rushed and missed details that mattered. He helped where he could, offering measurements, suggestions, and warnings about common mistakes. Not everyone listened fully, but even partial attempts made a difference. Cabins began to look thicker, more layered, less exposed. The valley slowly changed, not through regulation or planning, but through quiet imitation. What mattered most wasn't that others copied him. It was that people began to question assumptions they had never thought to question before. Why did warmth always have to come from burning more? Why did buildings have to struggle constantly against their environment? Why was simplicity so often mistaken for foolishness? The second wall became less of a curiosity and more of a symbol, proof that small, thoughtful changes could reshape an entire season. For him, the greatest reward wasn't recognition, it was relief. Winter no longer dominated his thoughts. He didn't dread the first snowfall or count logs obsessively. His body recovered from the constant strain of cold and labor. Even his mood lifted, shaped by the simple comfort of a space that supported him rather than challenged him. Survival turned into living, and that difference mattered more than any praise. The cabin itself became a quiet teacher. Visitors felt the warmth before they understood it. They noticed how still the air was, how evenly the temperature spread, how the walls no longer radiated cold. These sensations were harder to argue with than numbers or explanations. Once someone felt it, they carried that experience back to their own cabin, where the contrast was impossible to ignore. Stories spread beyond the valley. Travelers passing through heard about the cabin that stayed warmer with less fire. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, others stopped to see for themselves. A few carried the idea farther, adapting it to different climates and materials. The concept traveled the way practical knowledge always had, person to person, shaped by experience rather than instruction manuals. In time, the second wall stopped being his idea. It simply became an option, something to consider, something sensible. And that quiet normalization felt like the final confirmation that the winter had settled the argument completely. What began as laughter ended as acceptance, and acceptance was more powerful than applause. Standing outside one evening in early spring, he watched meltwater drip from the roof and disappear into the ground. The cabin stood solid and unchanged, the space between its walls now hidden again by shadow and light. It no longer looked strange. It looked right, as if it had always been meant to exist that way. Innovation rarely announces itself with confidence. More often, it arrives awkwardly, misunderstood and mocked, carrying ideas that feel inconvenient at first. Only after time and trial does its value become obvious. His cabin was a reminder of that truth. Winter had tested it honestly and without mercy, and it had passed. The neighbors no longer laughed. They measured, planned, and remembered. And long after that particular winter faded into memory, the lesson remained: sometimes the smartest blueprint is the one that slows things down, works with nature, and proves itself quietly, one cold night at a time.